Hello, everyone. It's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another edition of The Michael Shermer Show. This one brought to you by Wondrium, as you know, because I talk about it all the time. Wondrium is a series of college-level audio and video courses and documentaries produced and distributed by the Teaching Company, which brings you engaging educational content through short-form videos, long-form courses, my favorite, tutorials, how-to lessons, travelogues, documentaries. I also watch a lot of their documentaries and more, covering every topic you've ever wondered about and some you've probably never wondered about. Like, for example, here's one that I think is going to be super important given current events in America and other Western democracies. This course is called Democracy and Its Alternatives. Dig into democracy's definitions, duties, debates, and difficulties with special attention on how democratic governments have worked or not around the world and throughout time. So, for example, there's 24 30-minute lectures in this course. Number one is Democracy Built to Last? Well, I tend to think so, but it's not inevitable. 2, Politics and Personal Sacrifice. Government and the Invention of Law, the Rise of the Modern State, States, Nations, and Nationalism, subject of our next issue of Skeptic. Why care about Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau? Well, because that pretty much outlines the terms of the debate in the last 300 years about democracy and nationalism and states and so forth. Who gets to vote? Everybody should get to vote, adults, that is. But that's been a long struggle. The problem with federalism. Who backs authoritarianism? Authoritarians, the dictator's playbook. Oh, yeah, well, we know what that is. And so forth, all the way down to the last lecture in this course, Gridlock and Democracy. We've seen a lot of that. Anyway, check it out. That's just one of hundreds and hundreds of long-form courses you could take. If you go to skeptic.com/Wondrium, you can get a free trial of 2 weeks and 20% off the annual subscription rate. The subscription rate gives you access to all their content, which is great. You can listen to a whole course. You can take one lecture. You can bounce around, listen to multiple courses at the same time. Pretty much what I do. Check it out, skeptic.com/Shermer. Sorry, I gave you the wrong address. It's wondrium.com/Shermer. Wondrium, WONDRIUM.com/Shermer. And then that'll get you the 20% discount and the free trial. Check it out. Why would you not do it since it's free? All right. Thanks for listening. Here's our episode. Okay. Hi, everyone. It's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show. Just to remind you, I am the publisher of Skeptic magazine. This is my day job, publishing this. This is our latest issue on abortion matters. We have a whole new design. We're now 4-color inside and outside here, so it's quite nice. And we did a redesign after my longtime 30-year partner, Pat Lindsay, the art director, died last year, a year ago this month. And in fact, I've been featuring on the background there some of her original artwork back in the day when artists used to actually make physical artwork, not just digitized. That's her painting to capture the idea of human nature, evolutionary psychology, our primate past, and so forth. Here's Pat. There she is. We featured her on the cover of this issue, the last one of the old design. Anyway, check it out, skeptic.com. We appreciate your support for that. My guests today are Gail Pooley, an associate professor of business management at Brigham Young University, Hawaii. Nice. He's taught economics and statistics at Al Faisal University in Saudi Arabia, Brigham Young University in Idaho, Boise State University, and the College of Idaho. Pooley has held professional designations from the Appraisal Institute, the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, and the CCIM Institute. He's published articles in National Review, humanprogress.org, American Spectator, the Foundation for Economic Education, the Utah Bar Journal, the Appraisal Journal, Quillette, Forbes, and Real Clear Markets. His major research activity has been the Simon Abundance Index, which he co-authored with my other guest today, Marian Tupy. Well, this is much of the conversation will be about this Simon Abundance Index, so we don't need to address that at the moment. Marian Tupy is the editor of humanprogress.org, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity, and co-author of the Simon Abundance Index. He specializes in globalization and global well-being and the politics and economics of Europe and Southern Africa. He is the co-author of 10 Global Trends Every Smart Person Should Know and maybe the not smart people too, and many others you will find interesting. That was published by Cato in 2020. His articles have been published in the Financial Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, Newsweek, and the UK Spectator, Foreign Policy, and various other outlets in the United States and overseas. He's appeared on the BBC, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, Fox News, Fox Business, and other channels. Well, that covers the wide range of political spectrum there. Tupy received his BA in International Relations and Classics from the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, and his PhD in International Relations from the University of St. Andrews in Great Britain. Okay, gentlemen, thanks for coming on the show. By the way, here's the new book. It's called Superabundance, subtitled The Story of Population Growth, Innovation, and Human Flourishing on an Infinitely Bountiful Planet. So you have this kind of, I love the cover, by the way. I don't know if you can tell here, it's a beautiful kind of golden letter color over a sort of cornucopia. And credit to your publisher for publishing for color inside. So a lot of your graphs and charts here, just pull one up here, are in 4-color, which is really nice. That makes a difference. So I, as a longtime author myself and an old school baby boomer who appreciates physical books, I love the book. It's beautifully produced.
It's very kind of you. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to tee this off here for you because I know you'll have heard this kind of argument. Several years ago, Steve Pinker and I did a public event in Montreal, and he had just the week before been on Bill Maher's show, Real Time, in which Steve was touring for Enlightenment Now, which you quote from in your book, and basically saying, hey, things are getting better. And so Bill Maher said, are you kidding me? Things are never been so bad. And here Maher then lists all the bad things that are happening. You've heard the rhetoric. I'm going to just read this, and then you throw it out. Just how do you respond when you hear something like this? And then we can get into the specifics of it. So here's what Maher says, Bill Maher. ISIS, ice caps melting, depleted groundwater, identity theft, Russian meddling, campus rape crisis, opioid addiction, antibiotic-resistant germs, coral reef destruction, colony collapse disorder for bees, violence in football, drought, flooding, brain-eating amoebas, 1 billion people still defecate in the streets, police racism, oceans are lawless and polluted, solitary confinement, the EU is breaking up, refugees, church pedophiles, PTSD, and veteran suicides, bullying, homophobia, sinkholes, infrastructure crumbling, longer commutes, factory farm runoff, plastic in the oceans, endocrine disruptors, running out of water, running out of sand, your office is killing you. And then, of course, nukes and climate change. Okay, so just in general, have at it. How do you respond to just a big general overview like that?
Bill Maher actually does feature in the book in a number of places. Back in 2019, we have a quote from him basically saying one of the biggest problems with the world is too many people. And that's something that the book is obviously devoted to. But in terms of the other parade of horribles that you have shown, obviously rape culture or epidemic of rape on campuses, that's something that we know has not happened. That's something that has been blown out of all proportion. And there have been a number of cases where those kinds of issues have been actually, they've been fake news rather than real news. Other things that he's mentioned, he mentions homophobia. I would simply point to the fact that a record number of countries in the world allows for people of the same sex to get married and to adopt children. In fact, homophobia is at all-time lows in the United States and in other developed countries. He talks about running out of water. To some extent, it's half true in a sense that our known reservoirs of fresh water are in fact declining. But of course, new water still could be discovered. And more importantly, 75% of the globe are covered by water. It's just the wrong kind of water. And the way you get from wrong kind of water to right kind of water is through desalination, a technology that we have known for decades. And if you can power desalination plants by solar or by nuclear, then you have a perfect system through which produce plentiful water for everyone. Coral reefs, Only last week, we saw in the newspapers that the Great Barrier Reef in Australia is in its best health in the last 36 years. So I guess the point is that, Bill sort of fashions himself as a comedian, but I do think that a lot of people do not understand the difference when he's being funny and when he's being serious, because he mashes the two together, and they can walk away from his show thinking that the bit that actually he intends to be as very funny is real, and very often it isn't. And that's a problem with comedians, I think, a lot, because whenever you push back and say, this is BS, their response is, oh, well, I was just kidding, right? But when a record number of Americans get their news from comedy shows, then they may get a very, very wrong sense of what the world is really like.
Yeah, I would just add to that is what our great economist Thomas Sowell said. The first question that we ask in economics is compared to what, and let's assume that everything that Bill says is true. It's like, well, okay, let's assume this is all true. Well, we need to compare that, put it in context to what does that measurement compare to 100 years ago, where we had a different set of problems. We got this set of problems today, but we had a different set of problems 100 years ago. And would you really want to trade our problems today for the problems you had 100 years ago? So it's the trend that you really need to think about is, yeah, we are at this level and things are terrible, but they're much better than they were, even 20 years ago. When you really delve into measurement from this perspective of not compared to this utopia, but compared to what life was like yesterday. And what we really put on the table is, Bill, if things are so bad, why are things so cheap? And why do people live so long?
Yeah, another one of his great worries is the quality and the cleanliness or integrity of the food supply, for example. He's very big into dieting and nutrition and things like that. Well, if corporations are all poisoning us with bad food, how is it that throughout the world life expectancy is increasing? Life expectancy is the best proxy we have for how healthy people are. I think that part of the reason why we are in this sort of period of doom and gloom is, there are the obvious negativity biases that you have discussed with many of your previous guests. But I also think that in a country which is as politically polarized as we are today, there simply isn't a constituency for emphasizing all the things in America which are going well. So, if the Republicans are in charge in Washington, D.C., then the Democrats have an incentive to basically say everything is going to hell. And vice versa. When Democrats are in charge, Republicans never look at the things which are going well and are always looking at the wrong stuff. So essentially, there is no constituency for emphasizing the not necessarily optimistic, just the real state of American standards of living, for example, which is what we have tried to do in this new book.
Yeah, I call this the Jack Benny effect. When Jack Benny was asked, how's your wife? He said, compared to what? Which is kind of funny. But of course, that's your point. Even if all these things are true that Bill Maher just rattled off, which clearly they're not all of them true. But even if they were, how about some things to worry about centuries ago? Here was my response to Maher's. Riff there, plagues and diseases, smallpox, measles, leprosy, dysentery, tuberculosis, influenza, infant mortality and childhood deaths. How about dentistry and medicine? More dangerous to go to the doctor than it was to stay home. Famine, no supermarkets carrying plentiful supplies of fresh fruit and vegetables, milk, butter, eggs, and a million other products at a cheap price. There was no hygiene, no flush toilets, no toilet paper, no fresh tap water, no refrigeration, no microwaves, television, central heating and air conditioning. No internet access, no cheaply mass-produced books. Not that it mattered because almost everybody was illiterate. 90% of humanity lived in poverty. Today it's less than 10%. Forget pedophile priests. The Catholic Church's Inquisition might have burned you as a witch or tortured you as part of the Inquisition, and so on and so forth, right? So why is it then people have such a distorted view of the past? Is it you were just short-term thinking? Is it the negativity bias, the availability heuristic? Is it we just are ignorant of our past and the way things were?
Well, I do think all of those things. In fact, in chapter 1, we devote quite a lot of time and space to a variety of negativity biases, which are well known. Bad is more powerful than good, so we feel losses more than we appreciate gains. Good things tend to happen over much longer periods of time than bad things. It takes you a very long time to mature, to get educated, to obtain a degree, but it takes a second to get yourself killed in a car crash or being hit by a bus. Availability heuristic, which pulls out of that memory file in the brain all the bad things that you have seen with much greater frequency than is warranted by the real statistical probability of it happening in the world. And so you think that, an act of terrorism is much more likely to happen than, say, for example, slipping on a wet bathroom floor and killing yourself that way. So those are the things that I think that are in large part sort of hardwired in our brains, and there is very little that you can do about it except to know about them, okay? This is very important, to have the self-awareness to think and to understand that I'm reacting to something in a certain way because I was pre-programmed by evolution to do that. The thing which is in our control, but which we are not doing, is educating young people, or for that matter, any people, in terms of how far we have come as a species. The fact that we've been around for about 300,000 years, if you wish, as Homo sapiens, but we've been relatively prosperous only for the last 200 years. So that's like 0.08% of our time on Earth. And no textbooks, or rather, it's very rare that people learn about, the economy in the past or society in the past from perspective of how awful life really was. Because for that, students would need to be interested in economics and in history, or economic history, and people generally aren't. So that makes our job so much more difficult.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But the point is, but the fundamental point, which I think is important to understand, is that yes, human progress, as I understand it, and as I try to study it and write about it, compares to today with past imperfect, not some kind of a utopia. And if you are interested in that kind of perspective on progress, then all you have to do is to read a book, really, or look an advertisement from 100 years ago or something like that, to see what life really was like. Only recently there was a craze on the internet where somebody has pulled up an advertisement from 1956 refrigerator. This was the Frigidaire, top of the line Frigidaire, and it had some nifty features, and people were writing, I think 1 million people saw this video and were saying, I don't have a refrigerator like this. It was amazing in 1956. So Gale did the calculations and found out that back in the day, that Frigidaire would have cost you like 500 work hours. For the same number of working hours, you can get 13 refrigerators today.
Right. That's amazing. Yeah. Yeah, but that happens slow enough that you don't see it. My parents grew up in the Depression, which I didn't, and so they were all the way toward the end of their lives pretty frugal, even though they had plenty of money by then. My dad and I, after my mom died, we used to go out for burgers once a week and just talk. And he had plenty of money. I mean, he was a Ford dealership and sold it, and he's still clipping coupons for the $6 Burger King burger. I'm like, Dad, we really need to do this? Well, you never know. It's like, you never know what. I just didn't know, but he knew.
Yeah. I think part of what we tried to do is we recognize that people buy things with money, but they pay for them with their time. And so it means there's really two prices. There's a money price, but there's a time price. And the time price actually contains more information than a money price, because to calculate a time price, it's just what's the price and divide that by your hourly income, and it gives you how many hours it takes to work to earn the money to buy that thing. And we think that's really the index, the number that we should be using. It's the change in the time price over time that really reveals whether life is becoming better or worse or more or less abundant. So the refrigerator example, we just, wherever you look, you see these prices and people look at them and think, wow, that was cheap. And you go, yeah, it was cheap, but Grandpa, yeah, the Hershey bar was only 5 cents, but you were only earning 5 cents an hour. So it cost you an hour to buy that Hershey bar, and it's $1 today, but I'm earning $20. So I can get 20 Hershey bars for the time it took you to get one. So if you look at that ratio, 20 over 1, it's like, look at that percentage increase in this personal abundance that you're enjoying. And then the next step that we take is to look at that change in time prices over time of all of these commodities. And then we looked at products, we looked at services, we looked at blenders and washing machines and a pair of socks. And all of them are indicating this increase of abundance about 3 to 4% a year on the average. Well, that doesn't seem like very much, but what it means is every 20 years, you get twice as much. So imagine that you're paying the same price for 20 years and suddenly you wake up this morning and everything's 50% off. Everybody would be celebrating. And that's in fact what's happened, but it happens this slowly, 3.5%, 4% a year, and then boom, we get this doubling of abundance every 20 years. And once again, people, you've got to think. We tell people that, look, I think that we made this mistake in economics kind of early on where we tried to measure things in money, and we should have been measuring things in time, because time is this universal constant that everybody recognizes, and it can't be inflated, it can't be counterfeited, and that's really the thing that really we have that's scarce. So let's measure in time. Let's be scientists and use time to measure things. And when you do that, this whole different world emerges where you see, wow, we're experiencing this huge kind of superabundance. And then you consider that against the growth in population, and you go, how is it that everybody's getting more richer essentially, and population is also growing? How do those two things make sense together? And then I'll let Marian explain that happens.
Well, I would, yes. So the first, I would say the first part of what we think is our contribution to, or moving the state of knowledge a little further, is that we try to create a whole framework around time prices. Gail already explained it, but I actually want to make sure that I want to take a slightly different take at it, just to sort of re-emphasize the point. Whenever you open a newspaper these days, you hear about record prices of gas, record prices of this and that and the other. And that is because the newspapers are basically not even taking into account inflation very often. They are comparing nominal prices across time, right? And nominal price, there are three prices. There is the nominal price, there is the real price, and there is the time price. So I'll take them all sequentially. Nominal price is whatever you see on a shelf in a store, right? Or when you go and fill out your car, nominal price is whatever you pay for that gallon of gas at that particular moment that you put it in your car, right? And the journalists or the newspapers will sometimes say, well, it's a record high because it's, $5 and it's never been at $5 before, or even $6 and it's never been at $6 before. And that may be true, but it's a completely useless piece of information because it doesn't take into account inflation, okay? So once you account for inflation, once you account for the fact that every year the dollar in your pocket gets less valuable because the government prints more money, then you come up with this real price. And real price is just basically nominal price minus inflation, right? And that gives you, then you can compare 2 points in time. What is the price of gas today as opposed to 10 years ago? You've got to account for inflation. The problem with both prices, nominal and real, is that they don't account what is happening in your wallet. They don't account for the productivity gains of an individual human being and also of the species as a whole. So, when you are a little boy riding your bike through a neighborhood and throwing newspapers into people's yards, you are making a tiny little bit of money. But then later on, 50 years later, when you are a Wall Street banker and you are sitting there and reading those newspapers and sipping on a very expensive bourbon or something like that, in your lifetime, the productivity, you become much more productive, and therefore the amount of money in your wallet is much bigger. And the same applies to our species. 150 years ago, we used to use pickaxes in order to mine for coal. Today, we use these massive excavators. Okay, so a worker equipped with a pickaxe as opposed to a giant excavator is the giant excavator guy is much more productive, and that productivity translates into our wages. And as a consequence, under normal circumstances, every year wages increase above the rate of inflation. So in America, during the great period when we didn't have a very high inflation, inflation used to run about 2%, and people would get 3% increases in salary. What does that tell you? It tells you that the employer is accounting for the inflation of 2%, but he's also giving you 1% on top of that, and that's your productivity gain. That assumes that you become 1% more productive over the year. And once you account for that wage growth, right, then you can start coming up with time prices. How much does it cost you to buy a gallon of milk today, as opposed to how much time does it cost you to buy a gallon of milk as opposed to 10 years ago? And that is really a great way to estimate standards of living, because time cannot be inflated. Time cannot be in any way, it cannot be inflated. It's constant. It cannot be corrupted. It's constant. And so by translating everything into minutes and hours of work, we are getting around the problem of inflation measurement and inflation adjustment, which a lot of people find difficult to understand in the first place anyway.
Right. So maybe, let me see if I get this straight. Say in Shakespeare's time, you might look to see what a candle costs to light your home at night, how much a shirt or trousers cost, how much did 3 square meals a day cost. So what you're saying is that the price, even adjusted for inflation and so on, is not really capturing the effect. It would be, how long does that person have to work to get that candle, to light his home, to feed his family, to pay his rent?
So we have a really good reference to that. William Nordhaus, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2018 with Paul Romer, he did this great paper about the time price of light. And if you just go back to, say, 1830, to get 1 hour of light, you had to work 3 hours. And you think, well, I could work 3 hours and I can earn the money to buy 1 hour of light at night. So that's why when the sun went down, everybody went to bed. Today, because of these innovations that occurred, do you have any idea how much time it takes to earn 1 hour of light for a typical American?
I forget. It's almost free.
0.16 seconds. So it's basically free.
Wow.
So we've had this huge abundance of light that's come upon the planet that we tend to not think about today, because we just go touch a switch and we don't think about the fact that 100, 200 years ago, sun went down, everybody went to bed, and now we kind of can have this additional time of productivity or leisure or whatever that wasn't available to those people unless it was really, really expensive. They just simply couldn't afford it.
Yeah, and innovation, or if you want productivity, reflects itself in two places. By looking at real price of a good or a product, or a nominal price of a good or a product, you're only looking at what capitalism does to innovate the productive process of companies, right? What happened to that gallon of milk? Is it cheaper? Well, that's part of the equation. But what happened to your wages? Innovation also is reflected in your wages. So the time price looks at both. It looks at innovation in terms of the production process, what you buy in the shop, but it also looks at innovation in terms of how productive you are, how much output you produce. That's why we believe that time prices are the true prices.
Yeah.
So another error that we think, we made in economics is.
Let's clarify. Actually, before we go further down that path, clarify for us compound interest and what those kind of percentages mean in the long run? You know, when somebody says, well, the economy grew by 2%, but the previous year it was 3%, to the average listener, it's like, well, 2%, 3%, I probably don't even notice. Well, actually, that's a third difference, right? That's a huge difference. And how is it that the economy, if it's growing 3%,
it's actually 50% higher, right?
Yeah. That you could double your savings in, I don't know, what is it, 20 years at 3% interest, something like that. I mean, it's so counterintuitive. Just walk us through, how does this work?
You know, we're not very good at dealing with compound. We're not very good, you know, we're linear. We're not very good with these exponential functions. And it's one reason why when we think about a percentage compounded rate, we always try to convert it to how many years would it take to double something in size at that rate. We use this thing called the rule of 70s, and it simply says take 70, divide it by the rate, and that'll tell you approximately how many years it takes to double something in size. So if you're growing at 10%, it means every 7 years you double. If you're going at 5%, it's every 14 years. So this 3.5%, it seems like, 3-4%, that's not very much. That means every 20 years you double something in size. So I think being able to take people to that point, how long does it take to double, is kind of this first step of understanding these exponential compounding growth, and then extending that and saying, you know, it doesn't go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. It goes from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16, right? So helping people to understand this curve, that if you can get on this kind of a learning curve, an innovation curve, and stay there, you get to see this phenomenal growth in abundance.
And in our book, we go back to 1850. We look at 18 different data sets. That's 18 different data sets, with some of our data going back to 1850. Both, you know, goods, services, commodities, metals, fuels, etc. On average, we find that abundance, meaning what you as a person can buy, doubles every 20 years. But perhaps a slightly different way in which I could illustrate the question that you are asking to the viewer and the listener is this. The Bank of England has calculated that prior to 1750, the global economy was growing at 0.01% per year. So prior to 1750, the global economy was growing at 0.01% per year. How long does it take at that rate for the global GDP per capita to double? The answer is 6,000 years, right? So when I say in my talks that somebody living in ancient Egypt under the pharaohs and then using a time machine to coming to Rome at the time of Christ or to Britain at the time of the Norman conquest and feeling completely at home because nothing much has changed, that is absolutely true, right? Since 1750, the global economy per capita has been growing at 1.5% per year. At that rate, you double your GDP per capita every 50 years, right? So we have gone from a world which was growing at 0.01% a year to a world where we have grown about 1.5 to 2% a year. And that's a massive shift. It also opens up an altogether different conversation that we could have in the future about why is the last 200 years so fundamentally different from the previous 300,000. But the bottom line is that once you start thinking about abundance as being a novel concept, or rather, if you think that doubling of abundance every 20 years is too slow, just keep in mind that people have lived for millennia not seeing any kind of appreciation in standards of living at all.
Right. So here's an example. Let's personalize it. Let's say I have $100,000 in the stock market in an index mutual fund that grows 10% a year on average. So some years it'll be more, some years it'll be less. Are you telling me in 10 years I'll have 200,000? And then seven years I'll have 200,000, and then 7 years after that, if I leave it invested, dividend, reinvest it, and so on, I'll have 400,000 then in 14 years. I mean, it's astonishing that could actually be true.
It is true, Michael. Think about your father. And I look at myself, and I've had basically 3 doublings in my life every 20 years relative to my father. So I'm 8 times richer than my father was. And I went from 1, I doubled when I was 20, I was twice, went to 40, I went to 4 times, and another 20 years, I'm 8 times richer. And I think, am I really 8 times richer? And I start to look at his photographs and kind of where he lived and stuff, and I thought, not only am I 8 times richer on the average, I'm probably like 1,000 times richer in many respects. An iPhone. I mean, how much is that worth to have that device today? I love to survey my students and say, how much would I have to pay you to never use your iPhone again? Never use your iPhone or the internet again for the remainder of your life? I've yet to find one student that's willing to do it for less than $5 million. And then I say, well, you're all 5 millionaires then, right? It's not, in some cases, it's not the price we pay for things. It's what you would have to pay somebody to no longer use it. That's the value, right? The value versus the price. And value really, reveals itself when we start looking at what people are willing to pay and what we enjoy today relative to 20, 40, 60 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, I do want to make it a little more concrete, if I may. I'm going to give you a sense. One of the stats we did was, let's see, let's do food. People are always interested in terms of, how much richer or poorer we are when it comes to food. So one of the things we did, we looked at time prices, again, to emphasize, time prices, meaning how long you have to work in order to afford something. And we did that for 100 years in the United States, between 1919 and 2019. Okay, and let's do it for blue-collar workers so that people are not thinking that, we are looking at the rich. We are looking at blue-collar workers in America. So for the same amount of labor that would buy you 1 egg in 1919, a blue-collar worker now gets 36 eggs in 2019, okay? So from 1 egg to 36 over a scope of 1 year. So that's an appreciation in terms of percentages by 3,500%. Instead of 1 pound of sugar, you now get 26 pounds of sugar. Instead of 1 pound of chicken, you now get 26 pounds of chicken. Corn, instead of 1 pound of corn, you now get 25 pounds of corn. Let's look at something like ham, from 1 pound to 14. Milk, from 1 gallon to 13. What performs really poorly is, for example, steak. Instead of 1, you now get 3.5. Okay? So if a worker back in 2019 had to work, say, an hour to buy a pound of steak, now for the same amount of work, he gets 3.5 pounds. And that's the worst performing. There are obviously much bigger gains.
Why has that one not gone up as much?
I don't know. I don't really know the reason, no.
One thing that we do, we go back to this idea. George Gilder makes this statement. He says, wealth is knowledge, and growth is learning, and money is time. What it means is you can measure the growth of knowledge with time. So where we see these phenomenal increases in abundance, what we can conclude is you've had this growth in innovation, which is really this growth in valuable knowledge. It's valuable knowledge that's being added to our economy, and we don't see it other than little bits and pieces. We just see little bits of knowledge that appear in these prices, not only in prices, but in people's wages. And it shows up in all kinds of different products and services. Some products and services, we see this phenomenal increase. Other products, it's like it doesn't seem like it's very much there. But then we get really surprised when we look at something like sugar. And we think, well, is there a lot of innovation going on with sugar? Like it seems like a pound of sugar is a pound of sugar. What are they doing different? Well, we must be doing something different because we get 26 pounds today versus 1 pound 100 years ago. Something's happening with the growth of
that's not a good
valuable
example.
knowledge in commodity. Yeah,
terms of
right.
in terms of health. Maybe the sugar thing is not so good. Although, like that line about immigrants, I want to move to a country where the people are fat, where obesity is a problem.
Yeah.
Because in my country, we don't have enough to eat, right? So there, at least you have a choice, I guess. All right, let's move to the other counterintuitive one of your thesis that more people is good. I mean, since the 60s, we've all been hearing that more people is bad. Here we'll use your anti-hero Paul Ehrlich in his 1968 book, The Population Bomb. Quote, the battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, the world will undergo famines. Hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs. What should we do about it? He says, coercion? Perhaps, but coercion in a good sense, in a good cause, right? So, and then that got followed up with Garrett Hardin's The Tragedy of the Commons and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that talked about too many people. Let's see, Planned Parenthood, more Garrett Hardin. Let's see, I had some quotes here from some of these people. Oh, yes, right. So Barry Commoner in The Closing Circle, The Club of Rome, The Limits to Growth, the World Watch Institute's Lester Brown. I mean, we've been pounded on that too many people is a problem. That's what our intuitions tell us. It seems like that. What's wrong with that argument?
I've been talking too much. I feel like Gail can go ahead. But basically, who wants to? Look, human beings, on average, contribute more. They create more value than they consume. And that's because human beings are the only producers of new ideas. If you want innovations, you need ideas. And the way we describe it in the book is that more people you have, the more inventors you have, the more ideas you have that lead to interesting inventions, which then get tested in the marketplace to come up with innovations. Innovations then increase productivity and improve our standards of living. The reality is that in the absence of artificial intelligence, the only entities in the world capable of producing new ideas, whether it is about curing cancer or making beef more affordable or creating desalination plants, they all have to come from the human brain. And so it is not surprising to us that this period of great enrichment was happening at the same time as the world population was exploding. GDP per capita remains constant between the time of Christ or Augustus, if you are secularly minded, to about 1500s, 1600s, maybe even more, 1700s. When you look at the population, it hovers between 300 and 500 million from the year one all the way to 15 and 1600s. It's only when population begins to increase, a variety of reasons, partly having to do with the spread of science and scientific method and empiricism and whatever, you have numbers of people increasing, followed by increases in GDP per capita. So these two are mutually codependent. They are coterminous, but essentially what we find in our work in this book is that every 1% increase in population corresponds to 1% decrease in the time price of goods and services. I'll just repeat that once again. Every 1% of population, on average, reduces prices of goods and services by about 1%. To us, that means that human beings are more creators rather than destroyers or consumers.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, we can go back to Malthus and say, where did he make this fundamental error? And the error was made in thinking about, we live on a planet with a fixed number of atoms. And if you add more people, then the size of the slice is going to get smaller. And we recognize that, yeah, there is a fixed number of atoms on the planet, but economics is not about atoms. Economics is about knowledge. And it's the growth in knowledge that really makes these atoms more valuable. We're discovering new ways to rearrange these atoms to do other things with these things, these material things, that we really convert these material things into valuable resources by adding knowledge. And we really see no limit to this growth or this discovery and creativity of knowledge. And then knowledge also has this really interesting feature that it's non-rivalrous. I can share knowledge with you and I don't lose it. That's different than if I share a Snickers bar with you. So you have this economics of knowledge. You have this idea that innovation really fundamentally has to begin with human beings having the freedom to be able to think and then act on their thoughts, and then be able to take these inventions that they come up with to a market, a free market, where they can be tested. And innovation is a valuable invention. And the only way that we can really truly test that is in a free market. And that's kind of this key idea, is you've got to have free human beings that can act on their ideas, and then you have to have a place where those ideas can be tested. And those two things create this environment where knowledge suddenly becomes a very positive thing, that all of us now can look upon each other as not competitors, but joint collaborators in this discovery and sharing process of making all of us rich together.
Yeah. So whilst the number of atoms in the world are fixed, they can be arranged and rearranged in different ways, and it's knowledge which arranges them or rearranges them in a different way. Perfect example would be a car worth, say, $20 million, something like Bugatti Veyron. When you start driving it costs you $20 million, but when you crash it into a wall, it's just it's just a bunch of metal and plastic worth maybe $10,000. The number of atoms in the car and that heap of scrap is the same, but they've been arranged very differently, and the arrangement is the knowledge. And then how much of that arrangement, and when Gale says that the potential for discovering new knowledge is infinite, that is absolutely true. Paul Romer calculated that when you just look at the periodic table, once you start thinking about combination between 10 different aspects of the periodic table, then you realize that the number of possible combination is bigger than the number of seconds that have expired since the Big Bang 14.5 billion years ago, right? So, but who is going to make those combinations? Who is going to look whether you should be combining that part of the periodic table with that part of the periodic table? Right now, it's just human beings. Yes, we are helped by computers. But if we had 100 or 1,000 or 1 billion times more scientists and researchers than we currently have, we'd be able to do many more interesting experiments with supercomputers to come up with new compounds and new ways of doing things.
Right. So the Malthusian argument that populations grow geometrically, the food to feed them grows arithmetically, and at some point the former is going to outstrip the latter, and then you have population collapse, applies to some organisms. The petri dish with bacteria on it, and the whole thing collapses in a couple of days. Applies to animals that don't do what we do, which is solve problems and think creatively.
Right. Species that don't innovate. And right now it looks like human beings are way above any other species in terms of our ability to innovate. I mean, I'd love to have the ants and the bees help us innovate. And they kind of do, but not to the extent that we're able to do that, because we can not only come up with these ideas, but then we're able to test these ideas in the market to see if they're truly valuable or not. That's another key.
Yeah, a lot of the language you read in these environmentalists, at least the more negatively oriented ones, treats people as if we're cattle. Like, we're just sheep being shoveled around, and it would be better if some of us weren't born. Or, you shouldn't have children or whatever. Well, you first. Go ahead. But I'm going to live my life, right?
It's a difference between the biological way of thinking and an economic way of thinking. It's very interesting how many of these doomsters and gloomsters, many of them well-intentioned, we are not out there to bash anyone, but many of them who are very well-intentioned turned out to be biologists. Paul Ehrlich, who is still alive from Stanford University, is one of them. But recently I read a book by Heather and the Stone Age Mind. Well,
yes,
Brett Weinstein.
And Heather Hayne, yes.
Brett and Heather, whom I've been following for many, many years, and I'm a huge fan. They have so much to contribute. But Malthusianism permeates their work And in fact, that's the message that you take away, is that resources are finite. Yeah, they are finite to biologists because they are used to working with rats and rabbits and deer and things like that. And what happens when a deer faces a problem? Stares at the problem until the car drives the deer over. Human beings never do that. Consider something very simple as rising sea levels. Sea levels are rising at a slow pace, but they are rising. But people who are worried about the world being inundated by water simply assume that we are going to be standing in place for hundreds of thousands of years, just looking down at our feet as the water rises upwards. That's not how human beings operate. The Dutch were able to dry 1/3 of Holland at the time when they had a much more primitive technology and when they were poorer than the people of Bangladesh are today. What makes you think that the Bangladeshis are not going to react to rising sea levels in the same way that the Dutch were able to do 300 years ago?
Okay, so here's a good question. What's the difference between the Dutch 300 years ago and the Bangladeshians today, or a few decades ago when they had their crisis? Is it basic things like property rights and the incentive to innovate by giving patents, the opportunity to profit from your innovation, those sorts of basic characteristics of a liberal democracy and a free market?
Well, this is a chapter that Gale was heavily involved in, so I'll let him talk finally.
Kind of all the above. I mean, Deirdre McCloskey, the great economic historian thinker, she's got this great series of books where she highlights the Dutch and said, they had this really unique combination of things that occurred that really created this environment that suddenly innovation, and they were really this first place where this innovation people began to really escape poverty. And it was this combination of property rights and science. And it was also a key element is competition. You had competition between religions, you had competition between political powers, and that competition kind of gave room for individual innovators, entrepreneurs to go have a go at it. It's like, well, how do we actually compete with this other place, 20 miles down the road? As well, we've got to be able to think of a new way of doing things. So competition, the freedom to compete, where you had some stability with the monetary system, where you had some stability that allowed creativity. You've got to have order in order to have creativity. And they provided this kind of fundamental order that then jumped over to Britain and then spread west. And I think her argument's very compelling about why that happened. So the question goes back is, what's got to happen in Bangladesh in order for the same kind of emergence from poverty? They've got the human capital. There's no question they've got the human capital. Do they have the other elements that they need in order for this human capital to now be active? How do you activate that human capital? And I love to think about Steve Jobs. His biological father was born in Syria. And it's like, well, what if Steve Jobs had been born and raised in Syria? Would our world be different? I think it'd been a lot different. You took this guy and you put him in this other place where he was able to thrive and grow and flourish. And so then the question comes back to, well, how many Steve Jobs are in Syria today, or Bangladesh, or these other places? So it's really, you take these people and you either got to take them out of that place and put them in another place. Like you take Filipinos or Indians and you put them in the United States, and they earn 10, 20, 30 times more than they do in Manila. But what is it that they have to have in those places that's going to change the environment where they can now thrive? And we have a pattern.
Yeah, okay.
We have a pattern.
What is it exactly? Give us like the 10 things a country could. So if some poor third world country came to you and said, we want to be rich like you guys, what do we do?
Well, you take a look at Africa. And people think Africa's poor because they don't really have a good government. Africa is poor in many cases because they have too much government. To be able to start a business just watch a documentary with Magat Wade, and I think she's from Senegal, and she just talked about it's like 10 times harder to start a business in her country than it is in the U.S. And it's like, why are you guys so poor? Maybe it's because you've got this huge bureaucratic or regulatory burden that's attempting to maintain this status quo of people that are on top that are not letting people become entrepreneurs. So that's kind of this first step. You have to have this culture that's entrepreneur friendly, that's not protecting the top at the expense of everybody else. And what's that also mean? It means you got to be able to recognize some degree of property rights, and then you have to have a court system that people trust. You got to be able to trust the policeman. And then you've got to be open to this idea that let people be free to trade with each other. Don't step in, tax, and regulate. This ability to create new knowledge. If wealth is really knowledge, what are you doing? What are governments doing to prevent this creation of new knowledge? And that's, to create new knowledge, you need property rights and these other issues.
Yeah. Yeah, so you need some government, not too much. What role do you think there is for the government for infant industries to get systems started like the internet, for example, that we all benefit from? This was famously a government program initially. The interstate highway system, every company in the country benefits from that. Government built that. To what extent do you think there's a role for government to at least help nudge innovation?
I'm going to let Gale speak about the internet if he wishes to, because I don't know that specific story. I will point out that the United States became the greatest economy in the world, the largest economy in the world, before paved roads really took off in the United States. So I think it was by 1880 or maybe 1900 that the United States finally overtook Britain as the largest economy. The interstate road system begins to be built in the late 1950s and isn't finished until 1997, which is to say 8 years after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, 6 years after the United States became unchallenged superpower. So I'm not entirely sure whether the government needs to get involved in things that you very often hear in developmental economics. They tell you, we have to build roads. Well, not so fast. If a person in location X cannot sell to location Y, not because of the road, but because his or her goods got stolen by the local police chief or a corrupt government official, then it doesn't matter whether you have a 6-lane highway connecting the 2 points. There is no trade going to be going on because all of that was destroyed through parasitical government action. So I'm not terribly convinced by the arguments for roads. In terms of scientific innovation, I don't know enough about it. Gail, do you have any thoughts?
I would just go kind of back to this when people say, well, the government needs to do this. I always remind myself it's taxpayers that paid it. And they hired entrepreneurial contractors to actually execute the vision. So the question is, do you want to have a politician making the decision about what resources to use to create this, or do you want to have entrepreneurs? It's really this struggle between entrepreneurial vision and a bureaucratic vision. And what are you going to rely on to make decisions about how you're going to move forward? So that would be kind of the first thing. And then back to this idea of Marian's, the cost to ship a ton of freight over the ocean has fallen by 98% since 1956. It was really this innovation that occurred with containerization. And that was totally this kind of private innovation that happened. It wasn't government directed. But then you look at what Trump shows up and does to it. It's like, look, the price of shipping falls by this much, by 99%, but then you impose tariffs that prevent this trade from happening, prevent this innovation from really manifesting itself in terms of lifting everybody from poverty through this ability to use this new knowledge. So the bureaucratic mind versus the entrepreneurial mind, who has the power, who has the knowledge? When you separate that knowledge from the power to act on that knowledge, that's when you become stagnant. That's when you prevent this knowledge from really creating and manifesting value in your life.
I would simply add to that certainly within the African context, and it's possible that this is also within the Bangladeshi context and Indian context, increasing the number of bureaucracies and increasing the number of people on the state payroll was actually an electoral strategy by the ruling powers. Certainly I saw it in a country where I spent part of my youth, South Africa, is that, the bloc that continues to vote predominantly for the African National Congress are the government bureaucrats, right? Because they are directly dependent on salaries being paid by the government and therefore by the taxpayer. And so it is in the government's interest to increase the number of bureaucrats on the governmental payroll. Part of the reason why so many African countries have these absolutely mind-blowingly huge bureaucracies is because that is how they get their clientele to vote for them at the time of election. And that is why it costs more to send a container from one African port to another than from one African port to, say, France. It costs more to fly from West Africa to East Africa than to fly to Paris, than to fly from West Africa to Paris and then to East Africa. So, it's certainly a problem of institutional immaturity that these countries have not yet comprehended the limited role that governments need to play and have to play in the economic life of a country. The other problem, which is much more politically incorrect to talk about, but we are on the Skeptic magazine podcast, is, how do you create an independent judiciary in a country which has had no history of independent judiciary? In other words, as the officers of the justice system, from the magistrate all the way to Supreme Court, as they progress through the ranks, if they are corrupt, you're just going to end up with a very corrupt system that there is no way around it. Well, how did the people of Hong Kong get around it? Hong Kong, until recently, actually had a judiciary composed of retired British judges. So they would poach judges from countries which are renowned for their clean judicial system, and they would appoint them to the highest judiciary body in Hong Kong, thereby basically signaling to the rest of the world, if you invest in Hong Kong, it may have a Hong Kong stamp on it, but it's actually going to be adjudicated by people who have come from very clean judiciary environments. The problem with that is that it very much goes against nationalism and national pride. So in many of these countries, you would rather have the judiciary system not working than externalizing the ultimate judiciary function to an external authority.
Right. So you guys are pro-capitalist, obviously, but what you're talking about here is crony capitalism, right? It's kind of another form of economic nationalism. It's really mercantilism in Adam Smith's day. It's a zero sum. If we get ahead, then China loses or whatever. You still kind of hear that. So I presume you'd be against that kind of thing. But how do you prevent major corporations with their representatives in Washington capturing those benefits just through money, just by lobbying and so forth, in a free market like ours where the money is free to flow? You would kind of need some top-down government regulation about not allowing corporations and rich people to manipulate the system unfairly.
That's our next book.
Okay.
I will add to that. Look, I think that all societies sort of gravitate toward oligarchy. Any system, democratic, certainly non-democratic, but even democratic systems gravitate toward oligarchy in a sense that within any structure, you will always have people looking for ways to capture the system, earn the rents, gain unfair advantage. That is not that doesn't mean democracy is bad. That doesn't mean that capitalism is bad. It's just that you have to be on the lookout for the corruption of the system, because in the end, the system is still composed of individual human beings. And the individual human beings will try to maximize profit by doing as little work for as much reward as possible. And that would happen if we were a constitutional monarchy. That would happen if we were a dictatorship like, God forbid, Putin's Russia or Saudi Arabia. And you have to be on the lookout for it and put into place more checks and balances, constitutional amendments. It's something that every child should be taught in school, that this is how real life works. It doesn't matter how good the Constitution is, how well it was thought out by brilliant people. It can be corrupted. So we are not saying that capitalism in 21st century America is the best that it can be, or that democracy is the best it can be. The part of the reason why we are classical liberals is that we are not opposed to change. We don't believe there was some sort of a perfect state of humanity. We believe that any institution can be changed. You have to do it carefully so that you don't end up like the French Revolution. But we are open to change, provided that it's properly analyzed and that it's really necessary.
Yeah, I would just add to that kind of the key genius that we have in the U.S. Constitution is this idea of checks and balances, and that really is the idea of competition. It's like we're gonna create this system of government where these three, it's kind of paper, scissors, rock, where they're going to have to compete with one another, and that's going to allow the maximum amount of potential individual growth, because government now has to compete with government in the sense of being able to be captured. If you capture one of these institutions, can you capture the other two? And that's where it really becomes dangerous, is when two or three of them become captured, and then you don't have this sense of competition. I mean, the reason that we have what we have is that we have, the reason we have the standard of living we have is we have innovation, but the other component is we have competition. This market that really creates this environment where you've got to be able to innovate and learn to cooperate with your customers better than the other guy does. So this lobbying effort is really this effort to use the government to prevent this knowledge creation that would occur if you really had competition. So if you look at it from that respect, it's like we don't want to allow policies that do anything to reduce this competitive environment. It's really a knowledge creation environment where entrepreneurs can thrive and are free to go and pursue and create new knowledge for the rest of us, instead of this system where we're going to move the power over to bureaucrats, regulators, and politicians that really are in the knowledge creation prevention business. They prevent knowledge from creating.
And I would simply add to that you can see, believe it or not, I know a lot of Americans are incredibly down on the country right now, but you can see the system functioning to some extent. The competition between states is very important. We are seeing Americans leaving a state where it's become impossible to live in and moving to other states. Maybe the taxes are too high, maybe the social policy is too liberal or too conservative or whatever. Elon Musk has decided to move his headquarters of SpaceX from California to Texas, and by all accounts, he seems to be happy. So we do see the system operating the way it was designed at the level of the states, the competition between states. To the extent that America is working much less optimally than it could, is I think that a lot of stuff has been pushed up toward the federal level, where the government is trying to create laws for the whole country, regardless of whether it is appropriate for different states. Now, maybe the step in the wrong direction, I mean, there were many, I'm sure. You asked, is there anything specific that could be done? Maybe the elections of the senators should be taken out of the electoral process and returned back to the state legislatures. I don't remember which amendment that was. I think it was the 12th Amendment, but I'm not entirely sure. I am foreign after all. But until recently, senators were appointed by their assemblies in their home states and sent to Washington to represent the state interests, as opposed to being elected by the electorate. Maybe that's a a specific thing that could be done to change this to change this situation.
Right. So two more arguments here that you'll often hear. One from President Obama made that speech, "You did not build it" speech that conservative heads exploded over. And he was just trying to say, don't discount government entirely. I mean, we built the roads. We educate your employees. They got a K through 12 free education so they can read and write. And, electricity and just basically infrastructure, the bridges and so on, that helps you innovate. So it's not like you got up and created all of that by yourself. Okay. So there's some reasonable points, I think, to be made there. And then also, Robert Frank makes the argument, this is more against, I think, anarcho-capitalists, that this idea about, I don't want to pay taxes. Yeah, well, if you don't have a military, you're going to get invaded, and then you're going to be paying taxes to the new government. So you need some government, right? You need a military, you need a police force, you need a court system, and some system to protect your rights, your civil rights, your property rights, and so on. And then once you set that up, it starts to grow. I've long wondered if there's almost an inevitability to the growth of government bureaucracy, just because it's designed to do what it does, which is to continue to add more regulations. And as more people get into more conflicts, then you have to have more rules to resolve the conflicts. Like in bike racing, when I started Race Across America, with 3 other guys, we just had a 1-page rule sheet. Within 5 years, it was like a 30-page rule book. Because the athletes are trying to do anything they can to gain just a little advantage, like the example I give of, you're riding along and there's a crosswind and your support vehicle comes up next to you to give you a water bottle and you're getting now, the wind is being blocked by the support vehicle. So we noticed these guys were sitting there chatting with their support vehicles for like half an hour. Like, okay, we need a rule about this. You can only be up there 1 minute, 3 times an hour or whatever, right? Because this is what people do, or like doping in cycling or sports in general. Even if most of the athletes don't want to dope, just if somebody else is doing it, or even if they just think somebody else is going to hack the system, then I got to do it to be competitive. And then you kind of see the whole thing start to snowball like that.
Yeah, that's tough. I think back to this idea of, that you didn't build that. He should have added the second half to the sentence, was you didn't build that all by yourself, right? You had to have lots of other cooperation from lots of other people in order to create this. You had this little bit of knowledge, and you had to figure out how to find other people with little bits of knowledge to combine that in an organization. And then you had to have this stable environment that allowed this thing to actually gain traction and gain value. Creating order, the extent that government can come in and create order, this set of rules, this judiciary, this stable currency, those kinds of things then allow creativity to emerge. So to what level are we going to let the political environment provide that stability to us, versus you've got to be able to recognize that entrepreneurs now have to come in and create, be able to create value in these new goods and services that sit on top of this order that you can create. If the order becomes too much, you lose your creativity. If it's not sufficient, creativity can never emerge because there's not sufficient order for it to. You've got to have a channel that is pretty free of noise in order for the signal to actually travel through that channel. Too much noise, signal gets destroyed. Not enough stability in the channel, and you have the same problem.
But I think it's worse than that. The government has been in the business of crowding out civil society and individual application for 150 years. They effectively, private education in this country is not banned, but if you want to send your children to a private school, you have to pay twice. You pay the money in taxes for the public schooling, and then you pay money for the private tuition. So it's crowding out the amount of private education that could be supplied. So first they make it very difficult for you to go to obtain private education, and then they tell you, oh, by the way, because we are providing you with education, with public education that we forced you into, we are now asking you to pay more toward taxes, or we are denying your agency in the creation of whatever it is that you have created because you went to public school. Well, 100 years ago, I wouldn't have gone to public school if you didn't make it impossible for me to go to private school. 100 years ago, it wasn't the government that was building roads. Maybe it was being built by private agencies. So some of the best roads in South Africa, where I spent some time when I was young, were built by the private sector. Private sector creates roads to this day, just like the private sector used to provide lighthouses and God knows how many other functions that we now associate with the government. So to go around and say, well, because the government provides you all of these things, you now owe us something. Well, then don't provide them. Allow me to opt out of the system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on that issue.
And then we'll get along much better.
Yeah, I would add that when we decide that we want to have a service provided, we have to make the distinction between the financing of the service and the actual delivery of the service. And with public education, we've let government finance it, but we've also let them provide the service. So if we can make that distinction, yes, we'll let government, we recognize that education is a good that we want everybody to have access to. Let's have public financing of education, but that doesn't mean that the government should also be the provider of that service. Let's let competition
like charter
do
schools?
its right. Well, let's let competition do its magic in terms of innovation, where we don't have this monopoly in the provision of the service. Yeah, we will. You'll get a voucher. You'll get 7,000-8,000. Arizona just passed this new law where every family gets $7,000, and now you're free. You can go back to your local neighborhood public school if you choose to, and apply that funding there, or you can go someplace else if you choose to. And I think back to this idea: can we bring competition and innovation back into these systems that have suffered from these really low rates of productivity? And that's when you find a place where, Mark Perry has this great chart of the century, and where you see all of this stagnation in terms of, or these prices all going up. It's like, well, those industries tend to be heavily regulated and heavily, the provision of those services are from the government. They're not from competitive private sector players.
Yeah, one reason we have such different quality public schools in part is because they're funded through at least part of it through local taxes. So you get this kind of runaway effect where parents want to send their kids to the best public schools available, which are in these nicer neighborhoods. So that drives the housing prices up in those neighborhoods, which gets the school more money, which drives the housing prices up further. And on the opposite end, the inner city schools become ever poorer and crappier and so on. And you end up with this kind of massive divide in America, all because of the way the system is set up. And it's not like the parents are even noticing this. They just want the best for their kid. And, they're willing to work extra or whatever to get into that more expensive neighborhood to get the better school. Unless you forego that and just
imagine
go
this. Imagine this, though. What if, in order to shop at Costco, you had to move to a house that was close to the Costco? You couldn't drive down to the Costco.
Zip code, right?
You had to live within, and they checked you out at the checkout stand. When you came in, you had to prove that you lived within the same zip code, or they wouldn't let you shop there. It's like, right. We don't do that. We think it would be crazy. Yet in the public school system, you got to prove that you're in that school district before you can participate. Now we recognize that there's local property taxes that are paid, and there is this element of financing that contributes to the cost. But we gotta think much larger in terms of letting entrepreneurial innovation and knowledge creation serve everyone in all of these different industries that are struggling. Education and healthcare are the two that really suffer the most with this financing by government and providing the services by government. So you're getting this double effect of reducing this innovation that could be occurring in all these other industries.
That's right. In that chart that Mark Perry from AEI produces, there are only 3 things which are growing more expensive relative to wages. Housing, by the way, is not one of them. If you look at housing, it's increasing at a lower rate than wages, which means that it's becoming more affordable relative to wages. What's becoming more expensive relative to wages is healthcare, as you mentioned, education, and childcare. So, of course, what did the DC government pass last week? It passed a law saying that if you want to take care of children in Washington, D.C., where I live, you now have to have a college degree. So, of course, that's going to increase the price of childcare even more than it already is. It's completely insane. And if there is anything that is going to save us from this insanity, it is going to be precisely the experiments like are happening in Arizona and other places where these states are going to deliver better educational results and the rest of the country can learn from them, or at least let's hope so.
Okay, last example for on this theme of finite atoms. Can't remember if I got this from you or from Mark Skousen, the economist, that we will never run out of fossil fuels. You know, like I bring that to the students, they're like, what are you talking about? There's only so much fossil fuel in the ground. We're going to run out of it. Explain why we will never run out of fossil fuels.
Okay. When you walk into the store, what's more important to you when you buy a loaf of bread? The number of loaves on the shelf or the price?
The price.
Do you ever go in and count the number of loaves on the shelf? Or is it the price?
I have no idea.
So the first step is the price contains much more information about what you need to do in your life than the quantity. So look at the price. And as the price, if it's free to go up and down, it will tell you whether that thing is becoming more or less abundant. And if the price of fossil fuels goes up, 4 things happen. First of all, people use less of it. Second, people try to find more of it. Third, people try to find substitutes for it. And that substitute process is this innovation happens where we're going to go work on trying to discover and create some new knowledge that we can capture the price that we're seeing currently. And then the fourth thing with a lot of things is we're going to try to recycle it. Those 4 things cause this price. Yeah, it spikes, but it ends up going down. It ends up being cheaper than it was before. That was the insight of Julian Simon. He goes, yeah, we have these temporary things, but if you look at the underlying trend, this underlying trend is all these things are becoming more and more abundant. We didn't run out of, the Saudi oil minister said, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. You know, it ended because we innovated. And when the price of these things becomes so high, innovation has been such a great servant to humanity that it's converted these scarcities into these tremendous abundances, converting from a light that takes you 3 hours to work to get 1 hour to something that takes you less than 1/6 of a second. That was, we're not running out of light. We're not going to run out of any of these things. And I think Marian made this really interesting. He goes, find me one thing that we've actually run out of. What have we actually ever really run out of? The utility that we get from that thing.
We've never run out of a so-called natural resource or renewable resource. I mean, there are many different reasons why we are not going to run out of fossil fuels. Gail already mentioned some, but let's not forget that the Earth continues to produce fossil fuels through the typical usual biological processes, as it has done for billions of years. And should we ever get to a point where further exploration of coal and oil will become so incredibly expensive that we cannot go deeper, which is, you know, it's a hypothetical, it's never going to happen. We are always going to have better energy. We are going to look for other sources of even fossil fuels. Maybe we'll figure out a technology how to extract CO2 from the atmosphere and turn it into its own kind of a fuel. So we don't really know because we don't know what the future technology is going to be like. We don't know what marvelous future discoveries are waiting ahead of us. All we do know is that as things stand now, those innovations have to come from people, free people. China and India have been the most populous countries in the world for a very long time, but they were extremely poor. So it is not enough to have a lot of people in the world. You also need to have free people. They need to be able to speak, to think, to publish. They need to be able to invest, to trade. So if you want to really distill our work to its very essence, it would be that superabundance equals population times freedom.
Right. Perfect. So just on this point on inflation, since we're just coming down, the numbers finally starting to come down a little bit. Why does inflation happen, in your opinion? I'm not sure there's a correct answer to the question, but give us your thoughts on this. Why does it happen? And when the Fed adjusts the interest rates up, and that causes inflation to go down, is that true? Does that really work? Is it that simple? Are we doing the right thing? Give us your thoughts.
You got to get Mark Seglin from Cato to talk to you about that.
Okay.
One thing we do recognize is when you increase the money supply, this fundamental equation our fundamental equation of MV equal PQ, that money times velocity equals price times your output. When you increase the money supply and you hold output constant and velocity constant, it's all going to show up in higher prices. And the question is, where does that new money show up? It shows up where the guys who get a hold of it first and can spend it, those are the primary beneficiaries. But it doesn't, when we increase the money supply by 10%, it doesn't mean every price goes up by 10% and all wages go up by 10% at the same time. It's a discontinuous, it's not this nice smooth increase. So we're going through this period of adjusting to the new quantity of money that we have out there, and it appears in different products at different times. So we see real estate, we see the stock market, we see all this new money running to those commodities or running to those areas that are getting spent up because people think, well, this is a really good deal and it's not going to be affected by inflation in the future. And we say, okay, well, what's going to happen to everything else? And then fundamentally, where does it happen with wages? Wages tend to follow prices. They don't adjust as quickly as prices of things. And so inflation typically shows up in commodities, but then prices will follow and prices will catch up and exceed. We'll get back to this trend where that wages are actually increasing faster than prices because you're having innovation that's affecting both of those things.
I always like those.
I would simply add to that.
Oh, please go ahead.
No, I would simply add to that as I understand it, I'm not a monetary scholar, but I speak to a lot of economists on a daily basis. This is not just an outcome of fiscal and monetary incontinence of the government, but there was also a supply shock. We have shut down the global economy for 2 years, and I think that when generations from now on, in the future, look at what we have done, they will marvel at what a wrong-headed idea it was to shut down the global economy for a couple of years. To take this extraordinarily complex and interlinked thing, this organism, and to simply shut it down has created a lot of secondary consequences from which it may take many more years to recover. And I really earnestly hope that we are not going to be looking at COVID like we are looking at the Great Depression, where wrong responses to an economic shock have resulted in unbelievably negative geopolitical and economic consequences for decades to come.
Right. I was just going to say, I always like those news stories that we've been seeing for the last couple of months of, the news crews out there in front of the Chevron station. And it's like, why are the prices going up? It's a mystery. Well, why don't you ask the guy in the gas station why he put the higher number up there? And then my boss told me to increase the price. And he asked the boss, he goes, well, Chevron's charging me more. Okay, you go to the Chevron manager. He goes, well, the boss told me to raise it. At some point, somebody up there has to go, hey, look, we can raise our prices. So let's do it because that's our job.
Right. And I always tell people, it's Fedflation. It's not inflation, it's Fedflation. When you have the monetary central banks doing this growth in the money supply, it's all going to end up with higher prices unless you can increase output. And when you put this restriction on output, when you limit supply, when you lock down, it's like all this new money is going to go someplace. It's like we did the two wrong things. We increased demand by giving people money, and we reduced supply by restricting. Those two things will only result in higher prices. There's no other place the logic will take you than higher prices.
Mm-hmm.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah.
And we did it to ourselves. It's like, why did we do that?
All right, gentlemen, I want to be mindful of your time, but I want to hit a couple other ideas. You say in your book that you're not going to put a number on what's the optimal human population. That is to say, to what, how much can the Earth sustain? It's, we're coming up on 8 billion already. People think that's way too many. We can only sustain like 1 billion with, if we got rid of factory farming or whatever. All right, let's just set that aside. There's Stein's law, things that can't go on forever won't. How long could superabundance go for? Is it, is it infinite? As long as you have, I don't know, enough innovative people, there has to be some cap on the top, I suppose. But how do you think about the far future?
Well, let's do a quick analogy. How many keys are in a piano?
Ooh, I don't know.
88.
70 something? 88.
88. So how many songs are in a piano?
Infinite.
It's a trick question. There's actually no songs in the piano, right? All the songs are in the minds of human beings.
I see.
So you really have this infinite ability to create this music. Now, some music isn't as good as other music, but being able to take this limited kind of number of atoms we have on the planet and rearrange them and give people, it's really this, it's not so much population, it's this factor that we add to it, times freedom. If we extend to get innovation, it looks like you got to have people that are free to innovate. So you can increase freedom, you can increase population, you can increase both of them. But if you stop both of them, you're in trouble. So maybe population does kind of slow down. It looks like it is growth. But if you can have this addition of freedom, then you should expect to have this idea creativity system continue to grow that allows us to explore this space that seems to be infinite.
Yeah. Okay, so replacement levels,
I will simply add to that.
2.1 children. And I think you guys said there's, out of the 220 countries, 89 are now below replacement level. So should we actually be worried about a underpopulation problem in the coming centuries?
That is, yes, certainly. So replacement level is 2.1. It's something close to 100 countries in the world today where total fertility rate is less than 2.1. And predominantly, or rather the countries that dominate this group are advanced nations. South Korea right now, 0.9 instead of 2.1. Hong Kong, Spain, Italy, France even, the United States, 1.7. We are still growing because we are making up for the numbers with immigration, right? So it is a problem. Now, let me try to be fair to your question, but it's a little more involved. So obviously, I don't want to force parents to have more children than they want to. Naturally, I'm a libertarian. However, I also don't want parents to be making choices based on wrong information, right? Choices don't happen in a vacuum. They happen within a certain ideological zeitgeist, if you will, the ideas that sort of float about in the air. And one of those ideas is, of course, environmental apocalypse. That you hear this very often, and we give concrete examples in the book where people say we are not going to have children because bringing a child to the world is a selfish act of destruction, right? And so what we are saying to people is, have as many babies as you want. If you want just 2 or just 1 or no, but please don't base it on these crazy ideas about impending doom and gloom, because that is not what is going on, and it's very unlikely to happen. So the likelihood is that you are going to have a happy family, and you are going to, and your children are going to grow into adulthood and have their own families. That the likelihood of that happening is very, very high. So in that sense, we don't have we are certainly against any kind of coercion. Do I think the world is capable of maintaining many more billions of people? Yes, I do. Nick Eberstadt from AEI actually had a very interesting paper. I think I read a draft. I don't think it's published yet, about how the Earth could cope with 100 billion people. Now, we don't have to go up there. It's in a sense, it's one of those hypotheses that we are probably never having to deal with, because the population of the world is going to peak at around 9 billion in 2060 or 2080, and then it's going to be on a downward trend. So we are not talking about even getting to 12 billion people. We are asking whether 100 years from now, the world will have the same number of people as it is today. The likelihood is, Lancet estimates, that in 2100, we are going to have as many people in the world as we are having today. So, and that in itself has, of course, tremendous consequences, because as we try to show in the book, there is an intimate relationship between economic growth and population because of the important role of innovation and ideas in economic growth. So if you are looking at the population of the world plateauing and even declining, then you must also expect lower economic growth rates in the absence of some deus ex machina, maybe artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I would just add to that,
Gale?
Jack Ma and Elon Musk recently had this conversation, and they both agreed that the biggest problem facing the planet going forward is underpopulation. They both agreed that it's underpopulation is the problem, and it's interesting that would come from Jack Ma from China. And even if we were to stop it today, population growth, and we all went to 2.1, the other issue is the demographic of that 2.1. It's like our average age now is going to be much different in 50 years than it is today if you do that. And Japan's suffering from this demographic. And that's really, you look at Japan, 1990s, they start to do this. And why was that? They had this demographic thing that occurred to them. Today, you have more people over 65 in Japan than under 15. It's like they're facing a huge problem with the demographic aspect, not the size of the population, but the demographic of that population. And China's going to face that problem.
Yes, it appears Elon's doing his share to keep the population growing, from what I've read.
10 right now, right?
Yeah, 10.
So,
okay.
So yeah, have as many. Yeah, so have as many babies as you want. Totally up to you, but don't listen to the doomsters and the gloomsters.
Yeah.
The future is perfectly capable of being very happy and very prosperous. We are in a better place than we were in 1961 or 1962 when the United States and USSR almost blew themselves up in nuclear conflict. There is every reason to be rationally optimistic about the future. So please listen to reason and facts. Don't listen to this new religion of environmentalism, because that's what it is.
Yeah. Okay, let's fast forward way into the future. Let's do some trekonomics. Can you envision that we could get to the point where there's just so much prosperity for everybody that you don't even really need money? There's just everybody, you just have a replicator where you just go Earl Grey hot and you get your tea and the glass and so on. That is to say, this post-scarcity economics, that we don't have to worry about that. So here's what I'm getting at. There still seems to be a resentment of the people at the top, since we mentioned Elon or Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, or, you could count the number of families. There's like 12 families have like 80% of the wealth in America. Our intuitions are that just feels wrong. And I'm guessing your response would be, don't worry about the guys at the top. It's the people at the bottom we want to lift up that we should be focused on.
Yeah.
Well, the long-term trends when it comes. Sorry, go ahead, Gail, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that it's the people at the bottom that are actually the beneficiaries of all of this innovation that's occurring. Because when you look at these fundamental prices of commodities that are doing this, it's people that spend a lot higher percentage of their income on food that benefit from that, not necessarily you and I. I'd also say that, look, do you think the world would be better off if there was no Elon Musk, no Jeff Bezos, no Steve Jobs? Do you really think that this world would be better off, that you and I personally would be better off? The comparison needs to be not against who someone else is today, but who your grandparents were. It's that trend line that that perspective can change your total conclusion about where you are in life, and being able to look at the time price once again of things, everything. It's like everybody's getting rich. Yeah, he has this thing today, but in 5 or 10 years, I'm going to have that thing. I'm going to have a smartphone. I'm going to have a microwave. I'm going to have this thing that he has today. Don't be envious, be patient, and then think about how you personally can make a contribution in this growth of knowledge that everybody else now can also enjoy, that you are enjoying. That's what I'd say about it.
The other reason to be optimistic about when it comes to quote-unquote wealth distribution is that the attrition rate amongst the very wealthy is quite high. It's about 3% per year, which means that every generation you should end up with new people at the top of the earning pile than have been there before. I mean, this is not the first time that there have been a lot of very wealthy people around the world. There were the Vanderbilts, there were the Rockefellers, the Astors, and other people who are no longer featuring anywhere near the top ranks of the rich. And in fact, there are a couple of things to be optimistic about. One is that very few people at the top, in the top, let's say 10, maybe top 100, are actually people who have inherited their wealth. In other words, these are creators of wealth. This is very important, because so long as people like Musk and Steve Jobs are creating wealth, are improving my life, I don't really care whether they are sitting on $100 billion. I really don't. My life is better and that sort of thing. So they are self-created billionaires. And secondly, there's a huge attrition as you go over time. And so eventually these super duper rich families sort of disappear and are replaced by others. They become normal people. So I would say that's one thing. The other question you asked is it possible to imagine a post-scarcity world? Yes, if you define scarcity by what you and I desire but we don't have. Maybe you want a better bike. I would certainly welcome a tennis court in my yard where I can practice. But I rather suspect that people in the future are going to have more. Things that we have will be considered to be just the very basic, maybe even less than that, and their desires are just going to improve, and they're going to be much bigger. And like in the 1950s and 1960s, it was the height of luxury when you could fly across the United States from New York to California for a week, sunshine and oranges and things like that. I think that in 100 years, it will be like, have you been to Alpha Centauri, this decade or this year? Our desires are infinite. Going for a weekend on the moon, or going to Mars is just going to become just something that makes you into a good upper middle class, well-heeled type of person. And in that sense, I think that we are never going to be satisfied. No, I think we are always going to want more and more and more. And I see nothing wrong with that.
I just add one more little point that we talk about. We say that scarcity is about what we want. Abundance is about what we have. And you really can't measure scarcity because you're comparing it against infinite wants, but you can measure abundance. You can quantify abundance and say, what did it cost you last year in terms of your time? Turn the money to buy this, and what did it cost you this year? If it cost you less time, you are becoming more abundant. And this relative abundance that we're all enjoying, it's like smartphones. Everybody on this planet is going to have access to a smartphone within the next 10 years if they want one. They're going to be basically free in terms of the time price. And that's a phenomenal increase in abundance.
Right, electric cars too. I've followed this my whole life because I mentioned my father was in the car business, Ford dealership. So my first car was a '66 Mustang, which is primitive by today's standards. But I remember when the electric cars started taking off. My friend Bill Nye, the science guy, had one. I think it was the original General Motors one, which was a pretty ugly little car. And he came up to my house and he had to plug in so he could get home and that sort of thing. And then there was that documentary, Who Killed the Electric Car? And I thought, man, how come capitalism isn't working here? Why, we had more electric taxis in New York City in like 1920 than gas-powered taxis. What happened? How come this didn't take off? And of course, there's conspiracy theories about this, that the oil companies kept the wraps on the innovations or whatever. But then that all changed with Elon, right? He made it, I'm not sure what it is. I'd love your opinions on this. To me, it seems like he made it cool. Like, that's a cool car. It's fast, sleek, it's fun to drive. It's not an ugly, boxy little EV. And then, and then he sold enough of them that the price started coming down. Now what the 3 is, I don't know, 45, 50,000. So it's getting close to being, kind of a regular, like a Toyota Corolla type car. And then I'll tell you a funny story. I have a Tesla. And I love driving my Tesla, and it's so much fun. But then a couple of weeks ago, a buddy of mine came up to Santa Barbara and we had dinner, and I'm telling him about my Tesla, and he goes, Shermer, you got to come out. I just got the new Mercedes-Benz all-electric vehicle. So he has me sit in the thing, and now I go back to my Tesla, and I feel like I'm driving my 66 Mustang. This Mercedes is so nice. It is so much better than the Tesla. And I'm thinking, the BMW, I've seen that one. That's better than the Tesla. And, Porsche is an electric vehicle. And they're all, GM, Ford, they're all going to have really great electric cars. The price will come down. I actually worry that poor Elon's going to go out of business because, he innovated this thing and then got outcompeted. I hope that doesn't happen. But, I think that's what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, say what you want to about Elon Musk, but the man delivered. I mean, he delivered in two different areas. The electric thing, he delivered. He didn't just talk about it. He wasn't a government a guy talking about, how we should innovate. He actually did it. And then he does this thing with rockets. He really got us on the learning curve with electric cars, and he got us on the learning curve with rockets. And we know that every time you double the amount of output, the quantity that you produce, your costs drop between 20 and 30%. So getting on these learning curves is also a key aspect of being able to enjoy this innovation going forward. And you got to give Musk the credit. He's put us on these 2 learning curves that are really going to produce some results going forward. And he may, like you say, he may not benefit personally from it, but he's definitely creating the environment that entrepreneurs in space and entrepreneurs in transportation, with this redefining what it means to have transportation, he's moved the needle for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to read a passage from your final chapter here. From the vantage point of people living in advanced societies today, most past humans faced almost unimaginable hardships. Violence, disease, and starvation, which still bedevil the lives of the unfortunates living in some of the world's poorest countries, were compounded by deep and universal ignorance. To our ancestors, some of the most basic facts about the universe and the individual's place in it were unknown. To cope with suffering and infuse life with higher meaning, humans developed religion. The early religions, as well as all the great religions today, reflected the tragic world of yesteryear. To be more precise, they reflected a human psychology that was trying to make sense of a life that had, in Thomas Hobbes' famous words, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's a great passage. I love that. But so as we go forward and prosperity continues to increase, will we see the decline of religion and or other social institutions that we've grown accustomed to because they'll just fall into disuse? Or what are your kind of big thoughts on that?
I don't know. Who wants to start? You pick.
Okay, go ahead, Marian.
I think that we are going to continue to strive for the transcendental, regardless of where we find it. I like to say that whilst I myself am an atheist, I seek the transcendental in the work that I do, in the friendships that I have. They infuse me with meaning. Gale has 6 children, and 7. That infuses him with meaning. 7.
Yeah, you missed one.
7. And so I do think that I do think that in some ways it is we are the only animal that foresees our own demise. I think that is a profound psychological challenge, which forces us to behave in ways that are different from rats or bacteria. We know it's going to come to an end. Some people find solace in God. But what Pascal called the God-shaped hole in human heart, in my view, doesn't necessarily have to involve deity. It can involve things like working for the Skeptic magazine and publishing a book every 5 years, because you feel that you're going to live eternally through some novel thinking that 100, 200 years from now, somebody's going to pick up a book and say, hey, in this mad time in America in 2022, there was that one man, the voice of reason, in the same way that we look and still admire people like, Bacon and Descartes and people like that. And some people have large families and they see themselves, if not necessarily through God, they see eternity through their children and their posterity. So I do think that there's going to be something that is going to drive us toward striving toward transcendental, regardless of whether it is religion or not. My final point would be that it may well be that there are worse things that people will start to believe in than a neutered version of Christianity, Judaism, or perhaps some very mild forms of Islam. There could be other things that will fill that God-shaped hole in human heart, ideologies which will be incredibly detrimental to the world. So we have to be very careful.
Nicely put. Yeah. Gail?
I would agree with Marian on those ideas. I would just add a little bit that human beings have this need for meaning and this continuous search for meaning. And then I think we also have this need to have this sense that we are creating value. And it's really this value for one another. Economics is really this science of how human beings create value for one another. So ultimately, I think institutions that allow people to have additional ways of being able to discover meaning. How do you choose? We're going to let you make these choices in your life, and we're also going to let you create. If you let me choose and you let me create, I'm going to be pretty happy. And institutions that advance those two things in their societies, I think we're going to find them to be more and more effective, and we're going to value them more and more. And hopefully, we kind of see ourselves through this kind of darkness this darkness that kind of possesses us into this light of creativity and choice.
Wow, beautifully put. That's a great segue to reintroducing your book, Superabundance. We're not just talking about money. We're talking about all of human existence. Since I mentioned Star Trek, I mean, every episode has some dramatic challenge that the crew has to meet. Otherwise, it would be boring if it was just superabundance of everybody sitting around being happy and blissful. That's not what humans want. They want challenges. And so, this is what it's all about. And it's infinite, right? We're never going to run out of challenges. So I think much of human existence and meaning comes from facing challenges.
This abundance that we enjoy can allow us to be more creative, not more docile. It gives us the ability, it really gives us the time to be more creative if we choose to. And that's what we see as this huge benefit for humanity. It's like now everybody has more time to engage in these creative endeavors that can lift all of us.
Like that great quote from John Adams, why he's working on structuring the government and so on, is so his kids can go to school and become architects and engineers so that their kids can be poets and writers. It's cumulative. All right, gentlemen, again, thank you for your book. It's a beautiful book and a great read, really, but more importantly, the work itself and the information inside is really important, and I'm glad you're pushing the progress. The arc of the moral universe continues to bend thanks to work from you. So thanks a lot.